So thank you very much for inviting me to speak here. Basically what we are seeing today is a crisis of the neoliberal regime which the country had adopted in particular in 1991. You see, if you look at the period after 2004, under the neoliberal regime there was very significant growth rate of the GDP in the economy. This did not mean that there was an elimination of poverty, or there was an elimination of misery, or there was an elimination of hunger, malnutrition, etc. On the contrary, if you look at figures, then between 2004, 5 and 2009 figures we have from the National Sample Survey, the proportion of the population which is below a certain minimum calorie norm, which in India is taken to be 2,150 per person per day in urban areas and 2,200 per person per day in rural areas, that proportion has gone up. That means precisely in the period when we had very high rate of growth in the economy, you actually find that there was an increase as far as hunger, malnourishment, malnutrition is concerned. In India, poverty is defined in terms of that. As a matter of fact, these figures I am giving you, 2,150 and 2,200, are the figures taken in order to define poverty by the government's own planning commission. Therefore, you would find that if the proportion of the poverty-stricken population in the country actually went up during the period of high GDP growth rate. Now, this may appear surprising. Why should it happen? They say, of course, that there is a trickle-down effect of growth. We know there is no trickle-down effect, but even so, why should people be becoming worse off, which is what these figures suggest? Well, one of the things is that this period of growth was associated with an appropriation of public property, of common property, of petty property by large interests, large corporate interests, a process of what Marx had called primitive accumulation of capital. You actually found in this period that there was enormous amount of public property that was privatized, there was enormous amount of petty property that was taken over, and of course you also found encroachment on common property. A process of rapid primitive accumulation of capital was taking place in this period. And that necessarily means that a whole range of small producers, petty producers, they are not able to make their ends meet. Their economies become unviable. Let me just give you a very obvious example. Mr. Ambani is one who would benefit if you have an increase in diesel prices. Therefore, diesel prices are jacked up by the central bank. When diesel prices are jacked up, then the fisherman in Kerala, who actually runs a boat fitted with a diesel engine, his price has not got jacked up. His catch has not increased. As a result, you actually find a straightforward transfer of resources from the pocket of the fisherman in Kerala to the pocket of Mr. Ambani. Now that is a form of primitive accumulation of capital that Marx was talking about. As a result, a large segment of petty producers, small producers and so on become unviable. This is something which has been happening for quite some time. We know about agriculture, the peasant suicides, which means that the agricultural economy, the peasant economy has become increasingly unviable. The same is true of craftsmen, the same is true of artisans, the same is true, as I said, of fishermen. So an enormous segment of the population is finding it impossible to carry on what Marx would have called simple reproduction, just producing your life on the same scale as before. Now, as a result, they give up their business, they get dispossessed, they cannot continue simple reproduction, then they come in search of jobs to the towns. But again, one of the features of this very high period of growth rate, a very high growth rate period, is that employment increased hardly at all. If you look at again the same years, 2004, 5 to 9, 10, for which we have got National Sample Survey data, you look at employment, you you look at what is really proper, employment proper, that increase at 0.8% per annum, which is much less than the population growth, the natural growth of the workforce, and therefore this dispossessed mass of petty producers looking for jobs in urban areas, far from getting absorbed, in fact joins what Marx had called the reserve army of labor. In other words, they don't actually get proper, decent employment. They simply stay in cities doing all kinds of odd bits of jobs. You find therefore that in India in the recent period, even in the period of the high growth, the proportion of the workforce that is informally employed, semi-employed, unemployed, underemployed, casually employed, intermittently employed, that proportion has been increasing quite significantly. And that proportion's increase is indicative of the fact that the reserve army of labor is increasing rapidly. As a matter of fact, in the more recent period, even permanent jobs are really no longer available. Actually, even permanent jobs are made into casual employment. There is a significant casualization. As a result, it is not even, as in Marx's time, that there was a proletariat proper and there was a reserve army of labor. On the contrary, the permanently employed workers also, except when they are protected in some sense, the permanently employed workers also are becoming part of this intermittent employment, casual employment, etc. So the boundary walls between the two are gradually disappearing. Now this is something which they would like even further to disappear, which is why there is a demand for labor market flexibility. Now if you want to throw somebody out of the job, you have to give some notice. In fact, the corporate people say no such notice should be given, and therefore in effect there will be no difference between, as it were, those who are permanently employed and those who constitute the reserve army of labor. That wall will disappear. Anyway, the fact remains that if you have a situation where a whole lot of people are finding that their living conditions cannot be continued at the same level as before, therefore they are looking for jobs elsewhere, but on the other hand these jobs are not available, then it is natural that they would be pushed into the ranks of the poor. What is more, this enormous mass of people looking for jobs and semi-employed, casually employed also implies that the actually employed people, those who actually have jobs, their wages don't rise because their bargaining strength is sapped. Therefore, you have a weakening of the unions, and therefore you find that even the permanently, well, not exactly permanent, but even the employed find that their real wages don't rise, even as there is an increase in the proportion of all these semi-employed, casually employed, etc. All this gives rise to an increase in the magnitude of poverty. It gives rise to an increase in the intensity of distress as far as small petty producers, etc. are concerned. But at the same time, there is no doubt that this period of high growth also might have, after all, if high growth is taking place, if large numbers of people are not benefiting, somebody must be benefiting. And there is no doubt that this period of high growth, apart of course from producing vast numbers of billionaires and millionaires and so on, also benefited a segment of the urban middle class. I mean, there is no doubt about this, that a segment of the urban middle class actually did quite well out of this boom. It's quite interesting, when you actually look at figures of Delhi, this is the Delhi State Committee Convention, if you look at the figures of Delhi, as a matter of fact, precisely during the period I'm talking about, the proportion of people who are hungry and malnourished is something which actually has gone up dramatically in the Delhi city. Now when you say this, people say, come on, I mean, this is a city in which on average there is more than one car per person, so how can you say this? Now, obviously all these cars, more than one car per person, in other words, enormous inequalizing growth that has taken place in a city like Delhi. Now, more than one car per person is not because Mr. Ambani owns all these cars, but because significant segments of the urban middle class has benefited from this. And therefore, if they benefit, then this provides some kind of a social prop for the neoliberal regime. They are the ones who come on the media. They are the ones who talk, I mean, they are the ones who are in talk shows, they are the ones who talk about how good neoliberalism is and so on. So it also gives a kind of social, intellectual, ideological prop to the neoliberal regime. Now the crisis which is hitting has actually meant that even this segment is now no longer as enamored of neoliberalism as it used to be, because the number of jobs are not increasing. There is a dramatic, for them that is, even the number of jobs which was coming in the way of the middle class that really was benefiting from this is something which has gone down. Now, this crisis is visible in a number of ways. I think even today's paper itself says how sharply the growth rate has come down. And if the growth rate has come down, then employment, even of the kind which was being provided in the period of high growth, is no longer occurring. And if it's no longer occurring, then of course it would mean that even the segment which was doing well out of the earlier boom is no longer doing so. Inflation is rampant, and what is more, you also have a very serious balance of payments problem as far as the economy is concerned. You remember neoliberalism began in 1991 when there was a balance of payments problem. So the very serious balance of payments problem, which is being sustained by, for the time being, the country is able to put its head above water because in America they have decided to print dollars and flood the world with dollars because they want to keep their interest rates low. Some of these dollars are coming our way, and since they are coming towards India, you'll be able to sustain your current account deficits on balance of payments. But of course, the moment they stop doing so, or even announce that they are stopping doing so, you would find there is a massive balance of payments crisis, in which case the rupee would tumble as it was doing, in which case import prices would go up, in which case inflation would again go up. So the basic point is that even in its heyday, neoliberal growth was accompanied by an increase in poverty and increase in absolute impoverishment. Today what is happening is that of course that increase in absolute impoverishment continues, even gets accentuated because of inflation, but additionally you find that the crisis is spreading to the middle class as well, which earlier was a votary of this neoliberal regime. But when it is spreading to the middle class does not theorize it or think of it as if it's a crisis of neoliberalism, as if what you need is something else. What the middle class is theorizing it as is in two alternative ways. One is that we need strong neoliberalism. That means we need a regime that is strong. They think that the crisis is not because of neoliberalism, but because the Manmohan Singh government's weakness in pursuing neoliberalism. So therefore they want a Modi. They want a strong, authoritarian person who would actually pursue what they call governance and therefore, in a sense, recapture the period of that boom. That is kind of one way in which the middle class reaction is, that what we need is really authentic, hard-nosed neoliberalism. And the other kind of opinion in the middle class is that what we need is clean neoliberalism, corruption-free neoliberalism. And that is what the Aam Aadmi Party and so on stand for. They too don't see the crisis as a crisis arising because of neoliberalism, but they see it also as a crisis which arises because there's corruption in the economy, there's a lack of proper people, dishonest people and all the rest of it. And therefore, if you could rid the economy of this kind of corruption, if you could have a clean economic policy, and clean economic policy, since there is no critique of neoliberalism, one has to necessarily conclude ipso facto that the clean economic policy is nothing else but clean neoliberalism. And therefore, you have at the moment a situation in which the entire political space is taken up by votaries of neoliberalism. We have the Congress on the one side, that is Manmohan Singh and crowd. They would like neoliberalism, they are the ones who brought it, and they would like to pursue. You have the Aam Aadmi people who would actually not like to overthrow that neoliberalism, they would like a clean version of it, corruption-free. And finally, you actually have the votaries of Narendra Modi would like a really tough, hard-nosed neoliberalism, something which would actually really appease the corporate segments to an even greater extent than the current government is doing. Therefore, all the various alternatives being talked about, at least in the bourgeois media, are alternatives which represent in one way or the other a neoliberal alternative. Now, I said that the crisis is essentially because of neoliberalism. Now, why do I say that? I mean, fundamentally, you must see that the reason for the high growth that happened in India, if you look at the entire period since independence, there was a long period in which you had a sort of Nehruvian, what I call dirigist strategy. State played a major role, public sector played a major role, there was public investment, and public investment in turn was in areas like infrastructure, in capital goods, basic goods, in building dams and all the rest of it, in universities like JNU, and you had therefore a certain amount of expansion of the economy directly caused by this, and also this created demand, it put purchasing power in people's hands, therefore there was demand for all kinds of goods, and therefore there was growth in the economy. So that was growth that was led by really the state playing a very important role. In neoliberalism, that does not happen. Now, if that does not happen, then how does growth take place? How is it that markets expand? How is it that actually you have an expansion of demand and so on? Well, two ways. One, of course, is, well, one way, and that one way is that it is fueled by credit. Credit which is given for consumption purposes. I don't know if they get after you to buy credit cards and so on, they certainly get after me. That, there's enormous increase in consumption credit, and obviously the same credit system which does not give credit to the peasants who are now suffering from a crisis and who actually are now going increasingly to money lenders, that same credit system pushes credit for buying scooters, for buying cars and all the rest of it, and therefore you have an enormous expansion of consumer credit. So a credit sustained boom that way. The other stimulus for this is, of course, literally a stock market bubble, that you have, let's say, money coming in from outside. If money is coming in from outside, then that money gets in the stock market. You find that the stock prices rise, and when stock prices rise, then those who have invested in the stock market feel that they have become wealthier, and therefore they start spending more, and so on. Therefore, you have one way or another, in a neoliberal dispensation, one way or another, growth is sustained by bubbles. Either there's a consumer credit bubble or there is a stock market bubble. One way or the other, there is a bubble that sustains growth. Now, obviously, it cannot go on because people can't go on giving loans. I mean, even those who take loans for consumer credit, beyond a point, they are going to say, look, we have taken too much loan, they cannot take any more. So sooner or later, it comes to an end. The banks themselves say, oh, we have given a lot of loans, but there is no repayment, therefore let's not give any more. Likewise, as far as the stock market bubble or the housing bubble is concerned, is something which goes on for some time, or the land speculation bubble, and then it bursts. All bubbles necessarily burst after a certain point, and that's exactly what has happened. That in India today, on the one hand, the impact of the world capitalist crisis, on the other hand, the bursting of the domestic bubble. In other words, the bursting of the American bubble and the bursting of the Indian bubble have together combined to cause an economic crisis. And therefore, this crisis is integrally linked with the fact that we pursue policies where we have, as it were, relied upon American bubbles and Indian bubbles and bubbles anywhere in order to sustain our growth rate. That means basically, this neoliberal economic regime is one that makes employment, people's living standards dependent upon the whims of some speculators, whether they are located in America, located in India, and so on. That's the basic logic of this growth. And naturally, at some point, the speculators, in fact, don't expect things to be as good as before. Their expectations, which were euphoric to start with, collapse, and that's when the economy begins to collapse. That's what we are seeing. But none of the critics of the current government are critics who are saying this, other than the left, of course, Because what the others are saying, as I said, is that no, it's nothing to do with the basic economic policies we pursue. It's nothing to do with the basic economic policies which arise from the class structure of the society, but it is because we don't have clean governments, or we don't have, or we have kind of, soft, incompetent governments. What we need is a Modi, or what we need is a bunch of clean people like in Aam Aadmi Party, and then we would be back with high growth, and all this would actually disappear. Therefore, there is an attempt at the moment to appropriate the entire political space as far as one or the other version of neoliberalism is concerned. In fact, it's not surprising that precisely in a period of crisis, when one version of neoliberalism has hit a crisis, you find other versions coming up, or other kind of alternatives which don't transcend the neoliberal framework, nonetheless coming up in order to provide or suggest themselves as an alternative. Now, some people may argue that, look, okay, I mean, maybe this is true, but on the other hand, suppose, okay, just take the Aam Aadmi Party on its face value. They are saying that they are going to, let us say, weed out corruption. Suppose they weed out corruption, surely that's good for the people. In other words, what's wrong with it? I mean, why should one get particularly worked up and so on? I mean, I'm not getting worked up about it, but I would like us to be very clear between a left understanding and this kind of understanding. All right. Now, basically, let's just see what is corruption, why is there corruption, and so on. Okay, but there is corruption. You see, corruption as a systemic phenomenon, in my view, is associated with this whole process of primitive accumulation of capital I was talking about. You look at all the actual corruption cases, look at this spectrum, okay. What is the spectrum? There is public property, okay. The public property is being handed over at a price far below its market price. Now that's primitive accumulation. In other words, if you give public property to a private person at throwaway prices, then that private person is being allowed to accumulate an enormous amount of capital at the expense of the exchequer. So, the 2Gs scam is an example of a primitive accumulation of capital. And when there is a primitive accumulation of capital of that kind taking place, a part of it is appropriated by the minister, the bureaucrat, and so on. So corruption, if you like, is a tax on primitive accumulation of capital. You look at anything else, I mean, most of these corruption cases, coal block, let us say, again, public property being handed over to the private sector at a price, in fact, it is being handed over as captive coal blocks for them so that they can actually use it for their own production interests and so on. Now that again is a form of primitive accumulation of capital, because what you are saying is that, listen, all right, you can just have this coal block and use it for your own purposes. It is not being auctioned, they are not being asked to pay a price, but this handing over of resources is associated with corruption, which is therefore a tax on primitive accumulation of capital. So big ticket corruption is actually a tax on primitive accumulation of capital. And in fact, one can actually go further. One can actually even look at it sociologically in the following way. You see, in country after country, you look at India, for instance, or you look at any other country, what do you find? Who are the key decision makers? The key decision makers, let's say, are Mr. Manmohan Singh. In Congress, UPA government, Mr. Manmohan Singh, Mr. Chidambaram, Mr. Montek Singh, none of them has anything to do with the Congress. In other words, a peculiar phenomenon takes place in the current era in which the traditional political class yields its place to a bunch of technocrats, mostly from the World Bank or IMF or any of these financial institutions. They basically run the government on behalf of the traditional political class. I mean, the key decisions are actually taken by a bunch of people under the UPA government who have never had anything to do with the UPA. Okay? I mean, the Prime Minister himself has never had a Congress background. Mr. Chidambaram was in some other congress the other day, some Tamil Manila congress, and now so they have nothing to do with the traditional political formation. It's not just in India. In every country at the present moment, you would find exactly the same. Whether you take Turkey, you take Pakistan, you take any of these countries, exactly the same thing happens. You look at Greece, for instance, that the traditional political parties tend to get hijacked by or tend to incorporate all kinds of technocrats, typically technocrats associated with international finance capital, with IMF, World Bank, or some like Mr. Raghuram Rajan, he comes straight from the whatever IMF and becomes the governor of the Reserve Bank. So you find that technocrats take over through running the traditional political outfits. But on the other hand, as far as the traditional political class is concerned, the question we ask is, why does the traditional political class agree to it? I mean, after all, why should the old congressmen allow a Manmohan Singh or a Montek Singh to run the economy? What do they get out of it? What they get out of it is a cut in the process of primitive accumulation of capital. Mr. Manmohan Singh may be a very clean person, as they say, but Mr. Manmohan Singh pursues a policy of primitive accumulation of capital on which a tax is imposed by some minister or the other who may belong to this party or that party, and therefore this tax goes to finance, if you like, the support of the traditional political class for the neoliberal policies involving primitive accumulation of capital. Now you can see, therefore, I mean, you can actually see the way that economic factors actually subvert the process of democracy. I mean, one of the things, people are sick of it, people are sick of the political class, people are sick of the parliament, they have no respect for it because they think there are all kinds of crooks there. But on the other hand, behind this crookery is also an economic regime, the economic regime that actually uses crookery to buy support of the traditional political class for the pursuit of neoliberal policies. Anyway, so the point is, if that is the case, but you can still then say, all right, this may be so, but then if the Aam Aadmi Party is actually against all this, then what's wrong with that? Fine, there's nothing wrong with that if you can weed out corruption. But remember, if corruption, big ticket corruption, is associated with primitive accumulation of capital engendered by a neoliberal regime, in that case it would follow that any attack on big ticket corruption is an attack that has to take the form of an attack ultimately on the neoliberal regime. So then you may ask me that, all right, granted, that may be the case, but let these people begin by attacking corruption. Sooner or later they would come to the roadblock where they are bound to become anti-neoliberal, because if they pursue honestly the kind of trajectory that they are pursuing, that they are going to be against corruption and so on, in that case sooner or later they would realize that this corruption is something which can be got rid of only if you manage to get rid of the neoliberal regime, so that objectively they are sooner or later, if they pursue their anti-corruption agenda, and if you, that means if I, believe that corruption is linked to neoliberalism, then their pursuit single-mindedly of the anti-corruption agenda would bring them face to face against neoliberalism anyway. So what's wrong with that? The problem with that is the following. That you see, with all such movements, there is an undifferentiated, I mean, there's a lack of differentiation. Let me put it this way. Suppose it is the case that a student comes to me. We in JNU, we have a rule that, look, that you must submit your your sessional work before you're allowed to sit in the final exam. All right. A student comes to me, it has often happened by the way, saying that, look, I've been very sorry, I haven't been able to complete my term paper, can I give it to you in the afternoon? The exam is in the morning. So I have quietly said, all right, but don't forget, because if you don't give it to me in the afternoon, I'm not going to mark your script. The student has invariably given it to me in the afternoon. Now suppose that student, while saying this to me, bought a cup of coffee for me, that would be considered corruption by these people. You see, so that is what I mean by undifferentiated. That between the big ticket corruption that is associated with the allocation of coal blocks, that's associated with the spectrum scam, and something which may consist of a student offering me a cup of coffee while making a request to postpone the submission of something, they would draw no distinctions. And you see, it is this undifferentiated moralism that necessarily detracts from the class aspect of corruption. And the problem with all these movements, that is true of Anna Hazare's movement, that's true of AAP and so on, is that, you know, this undifferentiated moralism is something which actually detracts from the class aspect, which is why even the argument that, look, objectively, sooner or later, they are going to come up against neoliberal roadblocks is something which, therefore, objectively, sooner or later, they are going to become anti-neoliberal, is something that would not necessarily follow, because of the fact that being anti-neoliberal requires a class perspective on corruption, and if you don't have that to start with, you're not going to acquire it, because when that comes, when that happens, they may well say that, look, okay, that, let's say, consider any particular example. Suppose they don't raise power tariff. Okay, they're going to create some problem, because already power companies may actually create trouble, and at which point they may well say that the reason why there is a power crisis is not because the power companies are holding the city to ransom, but also because there are a lot of unauthorized fellows who are actually using power, and so let's go into their houses to check if they are actually using. In other words, once you have an undifferentiated notion of corruption, moralism is essentially an undifferentiated notion. If you have an undifferentiated notion of corruption, in that case, that can very easily take the form of vigilantism. That can very easily take the form, in fact, what I'm scared of is not even just vigilantism, that can take the form of a strengthening of the bourgeois state. Just imagine, like that example in Khirki, okay. Now, if someone tells the police, enter a house without a search warrant, okay, and if the police does so, in that case, it is actually strengthening the police against a private individual. Okay? The police is an organ of the bourgeois state. I believe all moral movements which do not have a class perspective end up strengthening the bourgeois state. Okay? Now they may say that, look, okay, but we are also for what you call devolution, decentralization and so on. If we are actually for decentralization, then how do we strengthen the bourgeois state? Because decentralization is something that actually implies, by its very definition, a denial of centralization. Therefore, it diffuses power, if you like. But on the other hand, while decentralization diffuses power, it also has the potential of strengthening each of these diffused centers vis-a-vis the individuals. Okay. Now you may know, for instance, that Ambedkar was very opposed to decentralization, because he was very clear that, listen, in a society like ours, if you have decentralization to panchayat level, then you would have the Khap panchayat, then you would have all these caste fellows sitting in the panchayats and discriminating against the Dalits of the village. So decentralization itself is not at all a guarantee against, as it were, a strengthening of the bourgeois state, because the panchayat is as much a part of the bourgeois state as the state legislature is, or as the parliament is. Therefore, the point is that an undifferentiated moralism, which is not anchored in any kind of an analysis of class, ultimately, in my view, willy-nilly, not that they plan it that way, ends up strengthening the bourgeois state. And I believe at the moment, all over the world, you are having, this is just my view, all over the world you're actually having a large number of middle class urban movements in Thailand, in Egypt, Tunisia. Very good, excellent objectives. We know that Shinawatra in Thailand was a corrupt fellow. He went and purchased an English Premier League club. So he obviously took lots of money on corruption. His sister, who is the current president, would also be no doubt taking money, through corruption for all kinds of private fortunes. We know that in Egypt, Hosni Mubarak was looting the country. We know that in Tunisia, Ben Ali was doing the same thing. So we know that all these movements, the best intention movements of the middle class, of urban persons, is something which is actually highly motivated, very well motivated, but because they lack a class perspective, they actually end up, look what's happened in Egypt. I mean, between Morsi on the one hand and the army on the other hand, this extremely idealist movement has got squeezed out, and you actually now have an army rule, which is again a strengthening of the bourgeois state. Exactly the same could happen in Thailand, it could happen in Tunisia and elsewhere. So I think one of my rubrics, as was pointed out, is that I should say something on the role of the youth and so on. You know, I do feel, I mean, obviously I'm an old man, you're very young, you're motivated by idealism of various kinds, but I'd just like to warn you that, you know, something, you see, Marx had said, if the appearance of things coincided with their reality, there would be no need for theory. Okay. Now, corruption appears, obviously we can all see there's all kinds of corruption, so get hold of these fellows. But you see, the appearance of things don't exactly coincide with their reality, in the sense there's a theory behind it. Why is it that suddenly there is this enormous proliferation of corruption? Why is it that huge amounts of money are suddenly being siphoned off? Why is it that the parliament as a whole at this time is beginning to be suspect in the eyes of the people? In other words, in order to get to the roots of social problems, it's not enough to have a moral attitude, you have to theorize about it. I mean, I think the primacy of theory is essential, by which I don't just mean that you become bookworms, that you cease to be activists. No, no, no. What I mean is that activism must be informed by theory. Activism that is not informed by theory is something which can actually end up achieving the very opposite of what it intended to achieve. Now you see, one of the problems with a lot of these movements, and that's true of the Aam Aadmi movement as well, is that it is anti-theory. It's anti-theory because of the fact, it's anti-theory and it's anti-program because of the fact that if you want to unite a whole lot of people, then you don't wish to go against their empirical consciousness. I mean, suppose it is the case that you have a certain empirical view of corruption, and I suddenly told you, no, 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 that's all wrong. Then you won't follow me, because it's quite likely that you would follow your own empirical thing unless you thought about it and so on. So a lot of these movements that suddenly come up and unite a lot of people do so on the basis of the empirical consciousness of those people at the prevailing moment. And in order to preserve that empirical consciousness, it becomes essential to do away with theory. I mean, I've talked to many Aam Aadmi, many Aam Aadmi intellectuals, you know, whom I know. I'd say, why don't you say something on ABC? They'd say, but you know, if we say this, we'll be alienating a part of our supporters. So you see, in other words, there is a deliberate downplaying of theory for tactical reasons in order to unite a large disparate element. I believe that actually that is, for young people, many of them are attracted because obviously they're raising slogans. All of us know in our private life that those slogans or those issues they are taking up are important issues. But if we approach those issues on entirely moral grounds, if we approach those issues based on entirely the empirical consciousness of the people, but not without any theory, in that case, I believe that you know, we would end up achieving something very different from what we intended to achieve. And therefore, as far as the student movement is concerned, I'm sure you'd have many discussions about what you should be doing in your day-to-day kind of struggles and so on and so forth. But I would just underscore the importance of theory. I mean, please read. Brecht had said, hungry man reach for the book. Why? He didn't say hungry man reach for the food. Hungry man reach for the book. Because in order to get rid of hunger, you have to get rid of the system that produces hunger. And to get rid of that system which produces hunger is not easy. In order to get rid of that system, you must understand that system, and you can do so only by reaching for the book. So it's very important that today, in particular, students who, I mean, the left has always emphasized theory.
I mean, Karl Marx, when he wrote the preface to the French edition of Capital, he says, I'm very sorry, he apologizes to the French working class, that the first 100 pages are a bit difficult. But you see, the point is, he expected the French working class to be reading his book. The left has always emphasized theoretical grounding. It has actually emphasized theory. And therefore, I would like to say that left students must play the lead in bringing back theory into the political discourse. And today, unfortunately, that is not there. Thank you.